Hey, welcome back, Daniel, to Legal Nerds. Daniel thought he was entitled to a vacation last week.
Well, yeah, I'm glad to be back. Thank you for. It was a vacation, but a lot went on, so I was trying to keep up as much as I could.
Well, I set this up. We've got a great guest today. And we have two great guests today. We have Mary Trump, who decided she'd be a guest and not a host. And that's going to be really weird and awkward for me, Mary.
Well, good luck. No
Oh,
pressure.
yeah, thanks. No
No
pressure.
pressure.
And our very special guest is my dear friend, John Bonifaz, who I'm going to embarrass him now, a MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, but that's not why he's here. He is here because of the breaking news about AOC, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I'm sure you just heard that she filed articles of impeachment today in the House against Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, two justices on the U.S. Supreme Court. And John is here not just as a legal expert, because he's literally the person who has been working closely with AOC's office to draft these. So he can tell us what's in them, since almost nobody has read them, and just the whole process and what the goals are. John, take it away.
Thank you, Jen, and great to be with you, Daniel and Mary and Jen. Thanks for having me. We at Free Speech or People, the organization I direct, we've been working with Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez's office on this, and it is a critical fight that needs to be waged to preserve our republic and our Constitution and ensure integrity at the Supreme Court. There is unprecedented corruption at the Supreme Court right now, and these articles of impeachment are required, frankly, to deal with the abuses of power that both Justices Thomas and Alito have committed. With respect to Justice Thomas, the articles lay out very clearly that he has taken hundreds of thousands of dollars of undisclosed lavish gifts from benefactors who have interests before the court. And then on top of that, he's refused to recuse himself from cases brought by those benefactors with those cases. And also his wife, of course, was quite involved in the Stop the Steal movement to try to overturn the 2020 election. He's refused to recuse himself from any cases dealing with the 2020 election and the January 6th insurrection. And with Justice Alito, he too has taken undisclosed lavish gifts from benefactors with interest before the court. He too has refused to recuse with clear bias. And in addition, of course, he's flown insurrectionist flags outside two of his homes, one of which, the upside down American flag, was flown at the January 6th insurrection, his primary residence in Alexandria, Virginia. Justice Roberts reportedly knew about the flying of that insurrectionist flag at the time that it was flying. At the time, the court was considering whether to take yet another 2020 election case that Donald Trump and his team were bringing to the court, alleging this massive lie of fraud in the election. And then we discover from the New York Times reporting as well that Justice Alito flew outside another home, a Christian nationalist flag, Appeal to Heaven flag, also flown at the January 6th insurrection. And despite that clear bias, Justice Alito has refused to recuse himself from cases involving the 2020 election, the January 6th insurrection, including Trump v. U.S., the immunity case that the court just decided. So this is a crisis for the Supreme Court, a crisis of legitimacy. And Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez is absolutely right to lead this fight and call for impeachment proceedings against these two corrupt justices.
John, thank you. You really covered, the facts and what is at stake here. Because we're legal nerds, I want to ask the first question, and I'll hand it to Daniel. What are the, how articles of impeachment, which you worked on drafting, there is the cause, you know what I mean? How many articles for each person, and what is the actual, the legal label for why this is, a high crime, a misdemeanor?
Yes, there are three articles against Thomas. There are two against Alito. All this is about abuse of power. These are high crimes. The first article against Thomas is his failure to disclose, based on all these lavish gifts that he's received, hundreds of thousands of dollars at least. Some may say it could be in the millions of dollars, and we'll, I'm sure, talk about Senator Whitehouse and Senator Wyden's letter to Attorney General Garland on this. But in addition to that article, there's an article about the conflict of interest that exists with respect to his wife's involvement in the Stop the Steal movement and his refusal to recuse from that, and his wife's own financial interests that have been represented before the court. Leonard Leo reportedly has provided funding to an organization that she directed. So these are the conflicts of interest. These are the grounds for these impeachment articles. With respect to Alito, there are two of them. One is his failure to disclose as well his lavish gifts. All this is required, by the way, by the Ethics in Government Act. Each public official has to file these disclosures, and they repeatedly have violated that law. But in addition, the second article is about his failure to recuse in the cases, and that too is with respect to Justice Thomas. These conflicts of interest are real, and every judge in the federal judiciary has a responsibility to recuse themselves when there is a clear bias or appearance of bias. And we don't even need to deal with, frankly, appearance of bias. There is a clear bias here with respect to these two justices, and yet they have sat and participated in cases dealing with Trump's lie about the 2020 election, dealing with the January 6th insurrection, and that has brought disrepute onto the entire Supreme Court.
Tangent.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I got a couple questions. I guess this is, I have two questions. One, what is I think our viewers and would like to know what the procedure is once this goes forward. And then also what kind of precedent you have on this. In our history, has this ever been done before? Has it been attempted before? And what were the bases? That's kind of what I'm curious about off the bat.
Yes. Yes, this has been done before. There are federal judges in the U.S. judiciary who have been impeached and removed from office from 1913 and 1926 to as recently.
I mean, I was more specific about U.S. Supreme Court.
Well, there's only one U.S. Supreme Court justice who's been impeached, and it was quite controversial. His name was Samuel Chase back in the 1800s. That is not applicable to the grounds here. So this is unprecedented with respect to the Supreme Court, but the evidence is unprecedented that these justices have engaged in this level of corruption. And then with respect to the process, there's two roads, Daniel, this could take. The Congresswoman may decide to introduce this as a privilege resolution. If she does that, then it requires a vote within 48 hours of business time on the floor of the House. If she doesn't do it that way, then it will be a matter that needs to first come before the House Judiciary Committee. We know the House Judiciary Committee is controlled, as is the entire House, by the Republican Party, and they would probably slow walk it or wouldn't even potentially allow for a hearing. But what's critical here is that this debate must begin. It must begin now. This level of corruption is unprecedented at the Supreme Court, and she's right, with colleagues like Congresswoman Omar and others who have sponsored this, to now move that debate forward.
Yeah, I guess as you mentioned, the Republicans control the House Judiciary Committee. So I'm sure you've thought about this, but yes, there should be an open debate. But have you thought about how that could pan out, knowing that he was in leadership?
Well, I think the likely response by the current leadership of the House is not to allow for this evidence to be aired in a hearing before the House Judiciary Committee or on the floor of the House. Now, they don't have a choice under the rules if it's a privilege resolution. There is a requirement that there be a vote, and statements can be made about that. The Congresswoman is going to make a floor statement this evening, I believe around 6:15 on the House Representatives floor, and people can tune in, I'm sure, to C-SPAN and watch it live. But there will be, I think, ongoing efforts to air out this evidence in the public domain, even if the House Judiciary Committee doesn't grant that hearing before them.
Yeah, so I like the direction of Daniel's questions. He's asking, I think, in a cerebral and gentle way, probably what some of the pushback will be and the sort of despondency people feel like, oh, great, like that's going to work. You know what I mean? And I am where you are, which is, sunlight is the best disinfectant, and electric light the most efficient policeman. Is that what it is? From Brandeis. I mean, I think this needs to be aired out. I think letting people know about what is going on and drawing attention to this corrupt Supreme Court is linked to, and I don't know, maybe we can pivot, is linked to the very problems we are having now with these unbelievably ahistoric and I believe wrong decisions from the Supreme Court related to Donald Trump and executive power. And I wonder whether this would be a good moment for you to talk not just about the corruption of these judges, but about the corrupt decision, either Donald Trump versus United States, or even the Anderson decision, where they quickly determined that, despite what Colorado decided, that he could stay on the ballot.
Yes, absolutely. And we, in fact, I should say, launched in April a campaign, scotusreformnow.org, where we've laid out this case for ending the corruption at the Supreme Court. And that does include these corrupt decisions. First, it's clear that Justices Alito and Thomas needed to have recused themselves from the Trump v. U.S. case, the immunity case, and Trump v. Anderson, the case dealing with Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. They refused to recuse themselves. What did that mean? Well, in Trump v. U.S., it was a 6-3 ruling, but it's important to note that Justice Barrett did not go along with all the majority's opinion. So if you actually do the math here, they didn't have a majority of 5 with Alito and Thomas having taken themselves out and doing the proper thing of recusing themselves. So it's a already corrupt decision by the fact that they did not remove themselves from that decision, from participating in that decision and voting the way they did. That decision, as we know, and as Justice Sotomayor and Justice Jackson have properly said in their dissents, places now the president as a king above the law. I mean, this is an outrage and total threat to our constitutional democracy, and it must be overturned. There's already a movement afoot to call for a constitutional amendment to overturn it. There may very well be a different court that overturns it, but we cannot have the president in the Oval Office thinking that he has the ability to commit crimes and get away with it without any responsibility to abide by the laws of our land. That's essentially what the court has done by drawing this claim distinction that if they're in the official acts of the presidency, they are immune. Those official acts, by the way, include the pardon power. So if the president of the United States wants to abuse the pardon power corruptly, getting paid, getting bribed to pardon somebody, or even pardon themselves for any crimes they've committed, now the court has essentially said they're immune from any abuse of the pardon power. And so this is a real threat to our republic, and it's a clear example of why it's so wrong that Justices Alito and Thomas remain on this court.
Can I realize that Mary is one of our guests, not co-host, and I'm messing it up, and I'd like to ask Mary a question about what she thinks about what John is saying and about the AOC articles of impeachment. You're muted, Mary.
Sorry about that. See, I'm a guest and I forget everything. I forget how to. I forget how to do a show. I agree with everything you said. I think obviously I'm not a lawyer, but from the perspective of somebody who cares about this country and who believes that the Supreme Court is there to uphold and defend the Constitution, it has been a quite horrifying term. And what has made it worse is the inability, or I get not inability, but the unwillingness of the Senate judiciary, which Democrats are in charge of, or do have the majority over and do lead, to do anything. So I think this is necessary. I think it's a long time coming. Hopefully it will light a fire under Dick Durbin. Not if that even would do any good. I'm not really sure. Maybe he needs a defibrillator. I'm not sure what is happening with Senator Durbin at this point, but it is not good enough to tell the American people there's this very, very serious problem. There's an emergency here, but because we don't have the numbers, we're not going to do anything. This is, Jen, you said it earlier. Sunshine is the best disinfectant, especially in the context of everything else is going on. The Democrats finally, after not doing this successfully for decades, need to make the Supreme Court a major issue during this election. The Supreme Court needs to be on the ballot as much as anything else. It is the most important issue because it redounds to everything. You're worried about a woman's right to choose. You're worried about climate change. You're worried about civil rights or election integrity. That's the Supreme Court. And right now we have an illegitimate supermajority destroying this country. We have an illegitimate supermajority, as John said earlier, crowning a president king, and not just any president, one guy. They used a sledgehammer and a scalpel to make sure that the only person who benefits from that corrupt ruling they made, in which they lit the Constitution on fire, is Donald Trump, a fascist who is out to destroy American democracy. And quite frankly, this illegitimate supermajority has done a lot of the work for him. So again, I think it's a great move. I wish it had happened sooner, but the conversation needs to start happening. And if it starts happening today, I'm all for it.
Yes, I have a couple. This is historic, I think, this effort you're under, and I applaud you for it. I clerked for a federal judge right out of law school, and one of the things that's different, there's 3 branches of government, but federal judges are appointed for life.
Right.
Congressmen, senators, they have to go for election, and so I think the purpose behind that is to try to depoliticize the bench, because certainly in Florida and most states, judges have to run for election. But the federal judges are, because they were purported to be set up to be independent, not political, they are granted this, lifetime appointment with no retirement age. And so the only remedy is an impeachment. So there's a couple of things that flow from that. In these cases that you're referring to about which you were questioning, was there ever any attempt to recuse any of the justices in that proceeding? Secondly, this impeachment being the only apparent remedy, because there also appeared not to be any standards of conduct for Supreme Court justice. Even here in Florida, there's a judicial qualifications commission where if there's an issue with the judge, a justice, you can raise it in that format. I'm not aware of that. So let's say, we all realize that impeachment with the current leadership there's going to be a lot of obstacles. Is there something based on where we are today that we can create some changes or reforms so there is at least some accountability for the Supreme Court justice? Because at this point in time, they are probably the most powerful people in the country, and if people are concerned about the justice now, this can flow the other way. I mean, just right now it's got very conservative, but things change. So I think this should worry not just Democrats, or it should worry everybody that understands that this Supreme Court has unlimited power, pretty much. So how are we going to change that if we aren't able to, impeach these 2 justices? There definitely needs to be a discussion and some sort of change, because there's nothing that can be done to these folks at all.
Yeah, no, Daniel, those are all excellent points. I mean, at scotusreformnow.org, we lay out several demands of how we must act to end this corruption of the Supreme Court. One of them is what Mary talked about. Senator Durbin must do his job. Senate Judiciary Committee must investigate full scale this corruption at the court. That includes enforcing the subpoena that it's already approved against Harlan Crow, the billionaire backer of Justice Thomas, who's named in these articles of impeachment that the Congresswoman has introduced today. Second, they must enforce the subpoena issued against Leonard Leo. They issued a subpoena against him. He said, I'm not going to comply with it. Steve Bannon's sitting in a federal prison because he refused to comply with a subpoena. People need to be held accountable when they refuse to comply with a congressional subpoena. And so Senator Durbin should move forward in enforcing that subpoena against Leonard Leo. But third, obviously, with all the evidence that's now come out about Justice Alito and the flying of the insurrectionist flags, subpoenas need to be issued against Justice Alito, against Martha Ann Alito, his wife, against Chief Justice Robert for what he knew at the time that these insurrectionist flags were flying, and against Justice Thomas and Ginny Thomas. They have a responsibility of oversight here. Senator Durbin has said, well, the hearing's not going to accomplish anything. Yes, it is. It's going to air out for the public the evidence of these corrupt justices and why they need to be held accountable. So that's all very important, needs to happen. Second is the impeachment process. And this is exactly why we've been working with Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez on these articles of impeachment. We think it's a critical step forward. Third is we've got to expand the court and we've got to enact term limits. We need to have these reforms. We need to have 4 new seats on the court. Important because the court has grown in terms of its jurisdiction. There's many more circuits than there were back when it went from 6 to 9. There's no requirement in the Constitution that it stay at 9 or be any magic number. And there need to be 4 new justices. And there's a bill pending in Congress, the Judiciary Act, that would do that. And enacting term limits is also critical because of the very point you make. This life tenure has now given them this idea that they're above the law themselves, that they can get away with this kind of misconduct and not be held accountable. And finally, we need a special ethics reform for the Supreme Court. There needs to be vigorous and enforceable ethics reform of these justices. They cannot engage in having conflicts of interest like Justices Alito and Thomas have and not being forced to recuse from cases like Trump v. U.S. and Trump v. Anderson.
Quick question for you and then one for Mary. John, what can we do to light a fire under Dick Durbin? Or what can we do, all of us here and listeners who want to lift what AOC is doing, support it, but also say, Durbin, do your job. As Lee Iacocca used to say, God, I can't believe I'm joining him with Louis Brandeis, but lead, follow, or get out of the way.
Yeah, well, actually this week, we're engaged in a week of action with Indivisible and Citizens United and other groups urging people to call their senators.
Wait, you just said Citizens United? You didn't mean that.
United and Citizens United. There's a group called
and
Citizens
Oh,
United.
and Citizens. Oh, sorry. Okay, got it.
END, and Citizens United. And these groups with us are pushing for calls to be generated to their senators and to Senator Durbin, urging that they do their job at the Senate Judiciary Committee. People can go to our social media feed at Free Speech for People. It's at FSFP, on Twitter, and find out more about how you can participate in these calls to your senator and to Senator Durbin. But the main message is do your job, enforce those subpoenas that have already been issued, and do a full-scale investigation of corruption at the Supreme Court. The people need to speak up on this question because it's our Supreme Court and our Constitution and our democracy that's at stake.
Well, I understand the subpoenas, but what can the Senate Judiciary Committee do? What's the most they can do in this situation under the current law?
Well, I mean, I think the Senate Judiciary Committee could certainly bring these justices before the committee under oath, force them to testify, and then if there is evidence that they've engaged in transgressions dealing with criminal violations, to refer those matters over to the Justice Department. And that is something already that Senator Whitehouse and Senator Wyden have done with respect to Justice Thomas. They've just issued a letter on July 3rd to Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, urging that there be an appointment of a special counsel to investigate Justice Thomas for his potential violations of criminal law, including the Ethics in Government Act, including false statements to the government. And we support that. We do think there needs to be that kind of special counsel investigation of Justice Thomas and, frankly, of Justice Alito as well.
I guess the official, I hate to, but then it begs the question of this new official acts doctrine. Presumably, who would decide whether acts taken by a U.S. Supreme Court justice are protected from immunity?
Yeah, well, I'd love for Justice Thomas's and Alito's lawyers to argue to the special counsel that they're taking of these lavish, undisclosed gifts of luxury vacations, that was part of their official act. I'd love to see those filings. I agree that they try to argue that, but that is exactly what needs to be aired. I know one other thing just on Trump and Anderson, because that was the case dealing with whether Trump would be on the ballot. And people look at that and they think, oh, it was 9-0. And that's actually a misimpression when you look at actually what happened in that case. 4 of the justices, Justices Barrett, Jackson, Sotomayor, and Kagan, they said that they didn't think it was necessary for the court to say that Congress needed to pass enforcement legislation. They wanted to leave the door open, frankly, for another way for Section 3 of the 14th Amendment to be enforced, either in federal court or via a federal prosecutor. They were clear on that. So there were 5 who said they invented out of whole cloth, these originalists, so-called originalists, invented out of whole cloth a requirement under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment that for federal elections, it needs to be enforced with a congressional act enforcing Section 3. If you take Alito and Thomas out of the picture because of their clear conflicts, they did not have a majority to issue that decision. And arguably, the fight to exclude Donald Trump from the ballot because of his role in the insurrection would have continued. And who knows whether he might still be on the ballot. So that's another example of how critically important and impactful this corruption is at the United States Supreme Court.
Before you leave, because I know you've got a hard stop in like 3 minutes, what didn't we talk about that you wanted to discuss, John?
Well, I think the biggest thing that we need to recognize is this is in our hands. I know we're relying on members of Congress to take some action, and we're calling on Senator Durbin to do that. And we're thrilled to be working with Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez in her action on impeachment articles. But really, this does, to Mary's point, this requires we, the people, to speak up on this. This is about our democracy and our Constitution. And I think from that standpoint, we need to deal with this corrupt Supreme Court. It is a threat to our democracy and our Constitution. The more we raise our voices with our elected officials, whether they be local elected officials or federal representatives, and demand that there be this accountability for these justices, the better off we're going to be in preserving our republic.
Thank you so much for joining us at the last minute, or less than 24 hours notice. I really hope we can have you back, and good luck on this campaign, John.
Thank you. It's great to be with you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
Take care now. Bye-bye.
Mary, do you have some thoughts?
I have several thoughts, but that was extremely helpful.
Yeah.
And I think because Democrats in a position of power have been so incapable of meeting the moment, it is cause for people to feel demoralized. We've seen this time and time again. We witnessed the crime. We know the crime was committed. In this case, we know Clarence Thomas is the most corrupt person ever to serve on the Supreme Court, unless there's something I'm not aware of. Samuel Alito aligns himself with traitors to this country. Neither one of these men should be on the court at all, especially given their wives' proclivities for aligning themselves with traitors. And yet they, as you all pointed out, they don't even recuse themselves from cases that any other judge not on a Supreme Court would have to recuse from. So 2 things happen. On the one hand, things get normalized. Well, I mean, how bad could it be if nobody's doing anything about it, right? So we stop believing our own eyes, some of us. On the other hand, we just feel hopeless, as if we have no agency at all, because apparently in America, with great power comes great impunity. It's not about being responsible. It's not about living up to any kinds of obligations. It means that you can get away with whatever you want to get away with. And that's what this illegitimate, corrupt supermajority is setting up for us here. So having the conversation and forcing these justices to respond, even if their responses are negative, even if they refuse. I mean, we've seen this with John Roberts time and time again. Separation of powers, bullshit. You need to be held accountable. And by the way, separation of powers doesn't mean you're an emperor, although clearly that's what the Supreme Court has decided it is. There are a bunch of mini emperors who also are kingmakers. So we need to see, the American people need to see how poorly they respond to this, how poorly Thomas and Alito respond to it. And we know they will, right? We know they will. That is also evidence of things not being that this is not a healthy democracy. And as I said earlier, the Supreme Court absolutely needs to be on the ballot, but it only will be if we have all of the information laid out before the American people.
Yes, I echo what Mary said. I think what some of the questions I had that I was asking some maybe procedural questions, and how judges and justices are dealt with. But as I said, the purpose of the third branch judiciary is to not be political. That's the whole purpose of it. That's why they have lifetime appointment. That's why they aren't elected. There's no term limits. I mean, those are the only positions in this country, governmental positions that I'm aware of, that have a lifetime appointment. And with that comes purposely the obligation for them is to not be political. So now we're at basically created a perfect storm. Let's go back to some of these justices we're talking about. Go back to the Judiciary Committee hearings with Justice Kavanaugh, Justice Alito. Let's go back to Justice Thomas. That was a long way ago. We know what happened. And then Justice Barrett, they were asked specific questions about precedent, about Roe v. Wade, about whether executive could be above the law. And under oath, they all made statements. And what apparently, as seems to happen regularly, is the Democrats believe them. And they voted. These all got through. They thought, so at some point, and I don't know when, the Democrats and the Republicans are not playing the same game. We're assuming they're playing by the rules. They aren't. So if we had the Senate Judiciary Committee, they could have, at several of those points had run by Democrats. They could have not voted against these. They could have done what Mitch McConnell did to Merrick Garland and said, no, we're not even going to hear him. But they don't. And so what do? We complain and we whine. I'm trying to, maybe I'm a little frustrated by this, but I'm a history major. I'm also a lawyer. I look at this. I watched the appointment, the interviews by all these judges. They were asked these questions and they lied. So what are we going to do about it? And so now you want to try to impeach these folks? Yeah, that would be great. It's not. Let's be honest. Is that going to happen? Are they going to get impeached? If there's a different Democratic Party leading that I see on a regular basis, maybe. But I think the problem is that we are operating on two different planes of reality politically. These justices, yes, should not have heard these cases. But they also know that they have. If you talk about presidential immunity, they have even more immunity. You're going to try to drag them into court, into hearing, and ask them questions about the decisions. They're not going to answer. They're not even going to show up.
Well, Daniel, that's a question.
What we need to do is we need to change. There needs to be reforms in terms of who can these people be accountable. These are young justices. They're appointed at young ages so they can be there forever. And we have to recognize that the Supreme Court, as it is now, has no accountability. So changes need to be made that we can actually get done, because if people look at this and realize, I don't think a lot of people realize that federal judges are appointed for life.
So Dan, I just Mary was going to jump in with a follow-up. That's all right.
I'm getting back in this.
That's good.
Okay.
Well, it's fine. It's totally fine because you were on a tear, as we all should be. I mean, because
I think we have to be.
Somebody's got to be. It's certainly not Dick Durbin.
No.
And but I think, to your point about the justices feeling absolutely no pressure to do anything right, we certainly can't get them for perjury because they can just say my position evolved, right? So that's not an option. But we know for a fact, again, that at least two of them have committed serious, if not crimes, although potentially crimes, tax evasion, for example. They have committed serious ethical breaches that render them unfit to be on the highest court in the land. there are no ethics guidelines that they will follow. They can be subpoenaed. To your point, they won't show up. I personally think the sergeant at arms should go knock on their door and drag them in. But that's not going to happen either. Exactly. Why hasn't Harlan Crow been indicted? Why haven't any? I mean, just for the Nazi paraphernalia alone, he should be arrested for something. But
in seriousness, he defied a subpoena.
I know, I know. And
where's Merrick Garland?
Look how long it took Steve Bannon to go to prison for that. So but we need to throw everything at the wall here, because again, the only weapon we have is information, and it is not getting to the American people. So let's make this a really, really big deal.
Yeah,
so we're going to hold on, Daniel. We're going to wrap at 3:40. So each of us, why don't we say our last words? Daniel, go ahead.
I think Mary hit it on the head. This election that we have in 4 months, we should be emphasizing the unlimited power that the Supreme Court has exhibited, how it's going to affect you, whether you're pro-choice, pro-life, Democrat, Republican. We don't want to live in a country where the most non-political branch of our three branches of government is this political. And I think we have a lot of great arguments in this campaign, but I think you're right. I think people understand the separation of power. Yeah, there is no restriction on their power, and so I think we need to emphasize: hey, there's a Supreme Court court right now that is running roughshod over your rights, and maybe you agree with them at this, but that's not the way our country was founded.
Thanks, Daniel. Mary, what are your final thoughts?
Yeah, I just to expand on that a little bit. Separation of powers only works if we've got the checks and balances in place. Right. And the Supreme Court has basically told us all to go fuck ourselves in that regard, because they will not be checked or balanced because of the separation. I mean, it's a completely maddening argument that Roberts has used. So we need to stop making this an election about two individual people running against each other. And we need to make this about who we choose to be as a country. Do we want to continue to be a democracy that tries to get better and make life better for everybody? Or do we want to be a fascist dictatorship? And we need to make it very clear to the American people that the Supreme Court of the United States, in service to one man and in service to an agenda that is absolutely anti-constitutional, has put its entire weight on the scale of fascism. That's terrifying.
And thank you both. I want to do the final push to say thank you to everyone who is watching us on this live stream. In case you're new to this, I want to let you know that we do have this live Legal Nerd Show every Wednesday at 2 p.m. And Daniel Uhlfelder from Florida and myself from soon to be Michigan are the hosts. I also want to point out that every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday, the general, larger Mary, I'm totally
every Sunday at 6:00 and Tuesdays and Thursdays at 12 noon Eastern time. The Nerd Avengers, our flagship show, is live. So please join us for that as well. And we have all sorts of other shows that Jen can tell you about.
And I'm not going to tell you about any of the others, but I just want to thank you and ask you, if you like this, please subscribe to the Mary Trump Media Network so you don't miss any of our programming. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.